Okay everyone, this is a short presentation which is meant to focus on the AO2 element of your exam. So you're bringing in your understanding of how language has been used by Orwell and how characterization and themes are all used by Orwell to appeal to the reader. Okay, so let's go through the PowerPoint. Stylistic devices. Right. There are some points that are adaptable. You can use them anywhere, no matter what the question is. One of the first points that you can use is anthropomorphism. Remember, the book is written in a style that is anthropomorphic. Therefore, the animals are all presented with human characteristics. There are two primary reasons for this to happen. One, it creates this whimsical or light-hearted tone to the story. It appears to be like a children's fairy tale or a fable, F-A-B-L-E. This light-hearted tone is really important because what happens is it tricks the reader. It gives the reader a false sense of security because we believe, I'll just write false sense of security, because we believe that the rest of the novel will adhere to that style. So when it all goes wrong, when the shocking things happen, when Napoleon orders that the throats are going to be torn out of other animals, the shock is doubled because it's not what we expected. We had this false sense of security, and therefore the shock and the impact on the reader and the animals is intensified because of this whimsical, light-hearted tone that opens the novel and seems to continue throughout the novel before cracks appear and we are shocked by how absolutely horrific the events in the farm are. Okay, another thing that anthropomorphism does is it makes us more sympathetic for certain animals. Boxer, for example, is given characteristics of being caring. Remember at the start of chapter 1 how he's so very conscious of where he puts his feet so he doesn't squish any of the little ducklings. And also too, that whimsical portrayal of Clover not being able to get her figure back. So it creates sympathy for the animals that we're meant to feel sympathetic for Boxer, for Clover, for the other animals that are not even named. It doesn't create sympathy, of course, for the pigs, but the anthropomorphic elements in relation to the pigs make us feel that we can identify with their flaws and we know where things are going. That understanding, that ability to identify their flaws as human flaws also creates this idea that we are not entirely surprised by how horrible things become on the farm. So you've got two conflicting things. You've got the tone, which is light-hearted, and therefore when trouble happens, it intensifies the shock of that trouble. And also the fact you have the sympathetic feeling towards those animals that we're meant to feel sympathetic for. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so as I said there, the anthropomorphic elements link to this tone of the fable. But what we also need to think too is about Orwell's style. Now you know that Orwell was a journalist. So if you look here, if I can find the wee button that allows me, he has this journalistic style of writing. Everything is quite factual. Everything is said in a way that presents it to be, keyword here, detached. So there's a detached relationship between the narrative voice and the events that are happening on the farm. It links to Orwell's journalistic style. However, what we must look out for are elements of descriptive language. Now, Orwell doesn't use them often, but when he does use them, he uses them because he wants you to know that this is a momentous thing. So, for example, just look at that little phrase, glorious thing. Now, that is an emotive phrase used once the animals have first kicked out Jones. When you think about it, what it does is it encapsulates the animals' happiness. They think that they have achieved the utopia that old Major prophesied at the start of chapter 1. So that little bit of emotive language, and you would just say emotive diction, glorious thing, communicates the level of happiness that the animals felt when they first kicked out Mr. Jones. Now, then what you could do is juxtapose that or show the contrast between another descriptive piece. For example, after the show trials, if you look here, you've got phrases like tore the throats out and the pile of corpses. Now that language is descriptive, that language is emotive, and it completely contrasts with the happiness and the optimism of glorious thing. So if you juxtapose glorious thing to a pile of corpses, in many ways that's a summary of where this book goes. It takes us from the euphoria, the optimism of the animals who believed they had their independence, who believed that they'd achieved some sense of liberation, to the pile of corpses that Napoleon has gathered round his feet. Those two descriptive elements in a piece that is not descriptive, that usually uses this detached tone, they stand out, and that's what Orwell wants it to do. He wants them to stand out so you can realise that this is shocking, that this is a momentous moment and it's shocking. So just as I said there, the reader is shocked by the sudden move towards sensory description, and of course that shock is intensified by the initial tone of a fable, because we never believed something like this could happen in what seems like a child's bedtime story. Okay, next slide then. Right, now no matter what question they ask you, you can bring in the idea of this as an allegory. That this novel, Animal Farm, is an allegory for events that happened in 20th century Europe, for the idea of totalitarian regimes. Now, it's linked to Russia and it's linked to the events of the Russian Revolution, but it's more than that, because Orwell is talking about any totalitarian regime. Now, in terms of allegorical representation, you've got Snowball as Trotsky. Now, Trotsky was he was a traitor to some, he was a hero to others, so he's a complex character. He's complex in that respect. He's not all good, he's not all bad. Stalin was, I suppose, responsible for the greatest genocide that the 20th century has ever seen. He is a character of hate. He is a hate figure. And Napoleon is linked to him. But it can't just be Napoleon as the bad guy. We have to talk about nuances. We have to talk about degrees of blame or degrees of culpability. And I'll talk about that later on. Okay, Squealer is representative not so much of a person but of this idea of a propaganda machine, and we as an audience know that propaganda is biased, we know that propaganda serves its own particular agenda, and therefore that biased, agenda-driven idea is linked to Squealer. And remember, to squeal on somebody is to betray them, so his name is particularly appropriate. Boxer represents the working class, or a fancy word for that is the proletariat. And of course we're meant to feel sympathy for them, but we're not to excuse them for the things that they've done wrong to get themselves in that situation. Boxer is not just a good guy. Yes, he's got good qualities, and we'll talk about that. But you need to remember that Boxer is deliberately stupid, okay? And to be deliberately stupid is to be obtuse. They've written it there in the corner. Obtuse. He's deliberately stupid. And he wakes up and he questions too late for everybody. So it's not just that, it's not like J.B. Priestley in Inspector Calls, where the working class can do no wrong. The working class are responsible for some of the bad things that happen to them. Okay, and the pigs, allegorical representations of any totalitarian regime, and Jones as well. The two of those are linked, and of course that's what we find out at the end of the novel. So no matter what question they ask, you can mention something about allegorical representation. Okay, next slide. Okay, now, I talked to you earlier on about the idea of complex characters. Well, here's a complex situation for you. It's not as if the world of the animals would be perfect if humans weren't there. There are problems and flaws in that world, because of all things that Orwell is, he's a realist. Okay, he's a realist. He understands that societies are flawed, and even if you take Jones out of the equation, the animals in Manor Farm are living in a world that is flawed. Those flaws are there in chapter 1, and they underpin what happens in the other chapters. So what Orwell has done is he has foreshadowed, he has subtly indicated the flaws in this society in chapter 1. They're there for you to notice, because what he wants to do is portray a realistic understanding of how we operate in this world. Okay, so some of the things that are apparent in chapter 1. Dreams are always threatened by the reality of facts. Now, I don't think that's something that Old Major totally grasps. But for example, in chapter 1, when they're all trooping in to hear Old Major, Molly's vain, okay, and her vanity is one of the reasons why she leaves Animal Farm. The cat isn't listening, so perhaps it's a metaphor for how not everybody can be taken in, or not everybody can assimilate the beliefs of others, even if those beliefs are good. That word that I used before, obtuse, well, Boxer is stupid, and sometimes we have these ideological desires, but we can't make everybody believe them. Some people are not capable of believing them. The pigs assume the power to instruct from the very beginning. Remember that Old Major is the one who's standing up higher than the rest, and he's instructing them about his dream. So that idea that there will always be leaders and always be followers is established just at the point where the idea of animalism begins. So leaders and followers in a society that's meant to be about equality is, I suppose, a paradox. And that's what underpins the entire rest of this novel. Everything will go wrong because there will always be people who will lead, always be people who will follow. And when you give power to leaders, remember that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Even from the very start, Benjamin is apathetic. And again, there are people who will not take responsibility for what happens in their lives. So it's not just the fact that the pigs destroy everything. You can see from this, by Orwell's use of foreshadowing, that everything, all the flaws that become big and huge and problematic in the rest of the novel are there from the start, because Orwell is giving you a realistic worldview. Okay, next slide. Right, just carrying on with that foreshadowing. The other thing you have to remember is that some techniques that the other pigs use and that we criticise them for using are actually used first of all by Old Major. And if you're going to see Old Major as the allegorical representation of someone like Karl Marx, you can't just see him as a hero. He's got complexity too, because Orwell's trying to be realistic. So for example, Old Major says at the very start of chapter 1, he says, and remember also that in fighting against man, we must not come to resemble them. Now, why does he say that? Because actually that's a prophecy of what actually turns out. Therefore, does he know deep down inside that this is a likely possibility, and therefore that's why he warns the rest about it? It comes to his mind because he knows it's a possibility. Again, that idea of foreshadowing, that we really shouldn't be surprised by anything that happens in the novel, because if we read chapter 1 carefully enough, we can see the clues. Okay, also, Old Major uses some tactics that we criticise Squealer for. First of all, this use of assertion, or to make it seem that this is a confident, irrefutable fact. So he asserts, he uses this quasi, which means half-factual tone, and he says, man is the only creature that consumes without producing. Now, he doesn't back that up with anything. He just asserts that, and we accept it. The animals accept it. Just the way that they accept from Squealer that the pigs are the brain workers. And again, we can't just see Squealer as the bad guy, because what he uses, the propaganda tactics that he uses to ensure the pigs maintain their tyrannical hold, are the same propaganda tactics that Old Major uses to try and bring about an apparently equal society. Okay, Old Major also uses quite naive or simplistic statements. He says almost overnight we could become rich and free. Now, you know, that just appeals. That's one of those, do you remember we said glittering generalities? Glittering generalities. That rich and free. Of course they want to be rich and free, but he doesn't give them anything concrete to allow them to get there. It's a bit like Snowball. When Snowball has his 3-day week and makes sure, says that everybody's going to retire. Again, and the idea about the electrification of the windmill. Of course people want these things, but how are we realistically going to get them? Well, Old Major doesn't give those answers. He just gives out that naive statement, those glittering generalities, and he builds up hope just the way Snowball builds up hope. But he doesn't give them any concrete ladder to reach that hope. Okay, he also uses this ad hominem attack. Now remember, ad hominem attacks are personal attacks. Like, for example, what Napoleon and Squealer do with Snowball once they've run him out of the farm in chapter 5. Now, he says, Old Major says, only get rid of men. Now that's too simplistic. That's an ad hominem attack. It's too simplistic. But he creates and pinpoints the enemy, just as Squealer and just as Napoleon do later on. Now the thing you have to realise is, here, using that sort of ad hominem attack is seen as Old Major being a great leader, and yet when Napoleon and when Squealer use them, we see them as being biased and dictatorial. So you have to remember that this is a complex situation. Okay, he offers maxims, wee simple statements, not solutions. All men are enemies, all animals are equal. Now, of course, they sound fantastic, but those maxims stop people really, I suppose, dissecting what they mean. Like, for example, think of boxers' maxims. Napoleon is always right. I will work harder. Those are simplistic statements that seem to cover everything but actually tell you nothing. They prevent people from thinking. They prevent animals from thinking. And once you stop thinking, you can be controlled. And that's what happens here. Also too, look at how Old Major's ideology is received. The animals are in the wildest excitement. They're easily manipulated here. Now you can argue they're manipulated for their own good, they're given hope, but could we then say that we're justifiably surprised when they're manipulated in such a, I suppose, I'm going to use a word I heard in the news today, deleterious or harmful way later on? That easy manipulation of the animals is there from the start. It was always going to be easy. All you had to do was manipulate them. And these animals were like sponges. They soaked everything up and questioned nothing. Like, look at this. With Beasts of England, having only sung it a few times, even the stupidest had picked up the tune. So what you can realise is that these are animals who never rationalise. They will just have emotional appeal. They will assimilate whatever they're given. Okay, next one. Okay, now, no matter what the question is, you can talk about the narrative voice. We talked earlier about this detached tone, like we're reporting on the animals, reporting on what has happened, and that links to Orwell and his journalistic style. Now, one of the things you need to remember about the detached tone is that sometimes the narrative voice offers the animal's perhaps interpretation of events. Remember that detached tone sometimes is influenced by what the animals are told, the propaganda of the pigs. The animals are never really aware of that. They're not aware of how much they're influenced by the pigs' propaganda. But here's where you have your dramatic irony. Okay, because the reader is influenced by the reader can pick up on what they can clearly see as propaganda. The animals just see it as, oh, well, that's the way things are. They do not question. Okay, go to the next slide, which has another bit of narrative voice on it now. Okay, so the narrative voice there, you can see it's third person narration, but what it does, sometimes it echoes the propaganda of the pigs. So for example, when it uses the damning diction, that the animals at least now are working for themselves and not for worthless parasitical human beings, that that's not Boxer who says, oh, they're worthless parasitical human beings because he doesn't know what the word parasitical means. So that is the propaganda of the pigs that's assimilated by all the animals. They don't know it's propaganda. They don't know they're being manipulated. They don't know what parasitical means. You know it's propaganda. You know they're being manipulated. And please God, you know what parasitical means. So what you have to remember is that there's this contrast between what the animals know and what you, the reader, knows. And that's called dramatic irony. So, for example, here, the rhetoric of Squealer and Snowball is something that the animals just soak up. Their narrative style mimics how easily language and the thinking of the pigs are, and that word that we had before, assimilated. And no matter what the question is, you can make mention of the narrative voice. Like, that's a good wee quotation. Worthless parasitical human beings, that no matter what the question is, you could use that to show how this character assimilates, or this theme promotes this sort of easy acceptance rather than thinking. It's something that you can use. It's adaptable. Okay, next one. Right. Now, no matter what question they ask, you can use this idea of the framing device. I'm going to have a wee drink of coffee. Hold on. Okay, now, the framing device of the 7 commandments. The 7 commandments are the structure of this novel, because they're established. They're established in chapter 2. They're developments from what Old Major has said in chapter 1. They're established in chapter 2, and then like skittles in a bowling alley, they are knocked down as we go through this novel. And each time one is knocked down, you, the reader, can understand how things are deteriorating. Now, the animals don't. They don't see them being knocked down, and they don't see the deterioration. They don't understand how what has been established as the central tenets of Animal Farm are slowly and surely being destroyed. This is a clever framing device that Orwell uses to make his message apparent to the reader, but it's not anything that the animals pick up on. So again, you've got the dramatic irony there. Now remember, there are 7 commandments, not 10. There are 10 in Christianity, 7 in Animal Farm. But just that use of the number and the word commandments is meant to link these two things, because both of them are, and here's a quotation for the book, seen as unalterable law. Unalterable law, that nothing can happen to them. But of course, the plot of the novel is that they are slowly but surely deteriorated. So there's a sense of irony that they're established as being unalterable, and yet, as we go through, they are altered. So it shows you that when it comes to power, when it comes to politics, nothing is sacred. Nothing at all is sacred. Everything can be used. Everything can be abused. No matter what it is, it can be manipulated if somebody wants to establish power. And that's totalitarianism. That's where you can just say, well, like for example, what happened in North Korea yesterday. In that totalitarian state, they decided that the defence minister had fallen asleep during a political rally, so they blew him up with a surface-to-air gun, because that can be done. Nothing is sacred in a totalitarian regime, even unalterable law. Orwell uses these as a framework so we can judge the pig's actions and chart how the farm descends into tyranny there. But again, that's what we're aware of, not the animals. Dramatic irony there. Okay, next slide. Right. Now, no matter who the question asks you to focus on, or no matter what the theme, there is this idea that in Animal Farm, Orwell tries to promote the idea of language as a weapon. Now, some people use that language as a weapon, Napoleon, Snowball, Squealer, and some people are hurt by that weapon. That's Boxer, any of the other animals. Okay, so no matter who they ask you to focus on, you could bring something in about language as a weapon. Now, remember, Snowball here, he uses language as a weapon to fight his ideological war. He uses language to promote his own beliefs. what he tries to do is he tries to confuse. He doesn't communicate, because communicate means that you're passing your message on, that you are making something known to others. Neither Snowball or Squealer communicate. What they do is they confound, which means they puzzle and perplex the animals, because they use language the animals cannot understand. He uses semantics, the meaning of words there, because what he wants to do is make it seem as if what he says is irrefutable. It cannot be argued with. He makes it sound logical. He makes it sound sophisticated. And if you're a stupid animal, you'll just go, okay, I don't know what that means, but it sounds good. So, for example, when they're doing the 4 legs good, 2 legs bad debate, and they're not quite sure what they can do with birds, you've got that birds' wings are an organ of propulsion and not manipulation. Now, what animal there understands organ and propulsion and manipulation? None of them. But that's the point, because you can confound them. You can use that language as a weapon to say, look, you don't understand it. I know you don't understand it. I do. I'm better than you. Accept it. So the animals do not understand complex language, and that's the point. That's why a language is used as a weapon. And it hurts people like Boxer, because no matter what Napoleon says, when Napoleon tells Boxer that Snowball was in league with Jones from the start, when he uses that language, Boxer has in his mind the maxim, Napoleon is always right. So he can't really understand the level of betrayal, perhaps, that Snowball is accused of, but he can understand Napoleon is always right, and therefore he accepts it. Its language can be used to confound, to hurt, and that is the main way in which terror is established. Okay, you can't answer a question in Animal Farm without at some point mentioning the terms of irony and satire. Now, we've already talked about dramatic irony, and that's the key type of irony that's used in this novel. But remember satire. Satire is when you mock humorously something that you judge as wrong in order to make it apparent that it's wrong, and in the hope that people will then do something about it. So, for example, let's just look at this one little element of satire. It says in the novel that the reading and writing classes, however, were a great success. Now, this is satirical, because later on in that chapter, it tells you how the success is measured, and this success is measured by reality. The reality being that Boxer can only remember 4 letters, Molly knows 6, and none of the other animals in the farm could get further on than the letter A. Now look at that. There's a wee quotation. Boxer can only remember 4 letters, or that none of the other animals could get further on than the letter A, even like further on than the letter A. This is satirical. How can it be successful if nobody knows what they're doing? But of course how can it be? But of course that's the propaganda. That's what that they put out there for you to believe. But you as the reader pick up on that. You as the reader laugh at the idea of success because you understand that it isn't. And that's what satire is there to do. The satire is not there for the animals. It goes above their heads. They never hear of it. It's there for you, the reader, for you to see how morally incorrect this situation is, and in the hope that we would do something about it. Okay, next one. Right. No matter what they ask you about, you can bring in the idea of the cyclical structure of this novel. Remember, it starts with a drunken, debauched leader, and it ends with a drunken, debauched leader. And there's a terrible tragedy when you think of everything that those animals had to go through, when you think of the euphoria that died, the hope and possibility that was taken away from them, the physical and mental pain that they've gone through, just to end up back where they started. But it isn't even just back where they started, because things are different now. When we had Jones as the corrupt leader, as the debauched leader, as the owner of the farm who was drinking too much, there was always the hope that was offered by Old Major and his vision. Now there is no hope. There is nowhere for the animals to go to hear about an optimistic dream of the future. So, in some ways, you could say that yes, the structure is cyclical, but the animals are in a worse situation because there is no possibility of hope. Now you have absolute tyranny. You've had the pile of corpses at Napoleon's feet. So that's what happens to anyone who tries to dissent. That's what happens to anybody who tries to quarrel with Napoleon. Therefore, there will not be an old major. No one is going to fill that position. And therefore, the animals are in this situation where they're stuck in a cycle of corruption and nothing is going to change for them. Okay, now this is an example of an introduction that somebody has written, but the key thing that I want you to do is look to see how many of those stylistic devices that we've talked about you can put into an introduction. So for example, in this one it says George Orwell in his ironically entitled Animal Fable, so there's your irony and there's your fable, Animal Farm, seeks to satirise the naivety of the animals, but also the cruel reign of terror of the authoritarian regime. So those stylistic devices that we've talked about today, you can put them in an introduction, you can put them in a question, no matter what the question is, but don't bung them in for the sake of it. You have to make it relevant to the key term. Every single paragraph needs to come back to the key term. So if it's about Boxer being a fool, then you can use some of those stylistic devices that allow you to do that, like language as a weapon, the use of assertion, the use of maxims, the irony, the dramatic irony that Boxer doesn't realise what's happening to him. You know, he thinks the pigs are flawless, that their ideas are successful, yet he only can learn the first four letters of the first four letters of the alphabet. How is that success? The dramatic irony is something that we, the reader, appreciate, but Boxer never does. So you must always root it to the question, but there are ways that you can use some of those devices in your essays. Now, everything that's in this PowerPoint, I took off our PowerPoints. All 10 of them for all the chapters are on Edmodo. Please, please, please use them, and good luck.